Welcome back to yet another episode of KTM Summer Grill. My name is Simon Chapman, supercars reporter for speedcafe.com, and today I have the pleasure of having Formula One reporter Mat Coch on board to talk about what was an incredible 2021 Formula One World Championship. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Simon. We are going to need, get your coffees, get yourself comfy because there's a lot to talk about in this one.
I have got pages of things that we could talk about from the 2021 season. I'm not really sure where we start, whether we go from the end to the start or what, but let's maybe have a chat about some of those flashpoints during the season. You know, there were so many moments involving obviously the championship protagonists, Max Verstappen, who ultimately won the championship, and Lewis Hamilton. And you know, I guess in those first few sort of races, it was kind of like, okay, yeah, we've got something brewing here. And then it all sort of came to a head at Silverstone, didn't it?
Yeah, that was for me the biggest flashpoint of the season. We all talk about Abu Dhabi because that had the ramifications in terms of the points classification at the end of the year. But it was at Silverstone that it went from being a good championship battle to something of a Prost and Senna rivalry, an absolute classic, because suddenly you had two guys that weren't willing to give up, weren't willing to give each other an inch. And I'm not going to say that Lewis Hamilton put Max Verstappen in the fence. That's, you know, it was a racing incident in my opinion, and Lewis Hamilton copped a penalty for it. But that's the point where the gloves came off. That's the point where the teams got drawn into it. You had the war of words between Christian Horner and Toto Wolff start at that point. And it rumbled on for the rest of the season. It was that incident at Copse on turn one that it went from being just a championship battle to an entire team war between Mercedes and Red Bull. It was fantastic. Something that we've not seen in a long, long time.
It's funny just thinking back now. Like I've literally got goosebumps thinking about it because it was just so enthralling. Like it's like nothing we've ever seen before. And I think we can probably all agree that it was probably one of the most dramatic Formula One seasons of all time. And obviously after we had that Silverstone issue, it sort of, you know, burned on a little bit. And then it all kicked off again in Monza, which obviously had some interesting results as far as Australian fans go.
Yeah, good result for us down here. But I guess if you're Dutch or British, probably less so. You know, Max Verstappen leaving his Red Bull precariously parked atop Lewis Hamilton's noggin. Not the best place to leave the car, and obviously not the best result for his championship hopes at that point, because he copped a penalty for that, which lasted a little while in terms of the effects that it had. So that was another little flashpoint that was things at that point I felt really could have got out of control, or as they transpired, they didn't peter out, but it just kept the thing simmering along. It could have really, really turned nasty at that point because it was a second clash and not too many races. The championship was very, very close at that point. You know, Max had lost his 30-odd point advantage that he had earlier in the season. It was nip and tuck, and whoever finished ahead pretty much in every race was going to win the championship. And here we have both title protagonists out midway through the Italian Grand Prix. Max looked like he was going to score good points. Lewis looked like he was going to score a few, but it looked like Max had the upper hand. And then all of a sudden, neither of them score any points.
Yeah, and ultimately it was Daniel Ricciardo who prevailed in that instance. There were just lots of moments during the season where you just thought this couldn't get any crazier. And then obviously we got to Hungary and quite possibly one of the most bizarre incidents that we've ever seen, I think, in Formula One history. Obviously, you know, the race start sort of played out. You know, we saw, I believe it was Valtteri Bottas lose control of his car. Max Verstappen obviously got caught up in all of that drama. And then inevitably the red flag was drawn because of all the debris that was left down at turn one. And we had this extraordinary sequence of events where the track was wet and starting to dry, and we had basically everyone come into the pit lane to put slick tyres on except for Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, he was on both pole position and dead last on the grid at the same time. The only man on the grid. I've never seen that before in any sort of racing. I think the closest was MotoGP a few years ago with Jack Miller in a similar sort of scenario. But yeah, that was an extraordinary race. Shades of Spa 1998 for those who are perhaps as old as I am. Yeah, it was it was extraordinary. And then to see, Max Verstappen charge back through the car, and if you saw photos of that Red Bull afterwards, it was missing half of its aero down, I think it was the right-hand side. So he was battling hard just to keep the thing on the road. Lewis Hamilton did well, but Fernando Alonso, man of the match, in spoiling his charge forward and handing Esteban Ocon and Alpine its first win under that name. Obviously, the team's won races and championships before, but yeah, that was an extraordinary race, and one that had, or potentially had, massive ramifications after turn one. As it was a little bit limited and a little bit nullified in the end, but an extraordinary event, and just another little glimpse of how bizarre 2021 actually was.
And then, of course, we got to Saudi Arabia, the first time that we've raced at the Jeddah circuit. Quite possibly one of the most interesting new circuits that we've had in recent years. It sort of looked like one of those drawings that maybe your 5-year-old son does at play school. Just 27 corners or something ridiculous like that. And the ridiculous layout led to some ridiculous sort of circumstances. We saw Max Verstappen have that incident in qualifying when he looked almost certain to get pole position. And then obviously during the race there, we had some just incredible scenes. So just run us through that weekend, because I think you could probably better dissect it than I could.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary venue. One of the most high-speed circuits that Formula One goes to, the second fastest after Monza, which, when you've got walls on either side, gives you an idea of the sort of risk that's involved. Max Verstappen was absolutely pushing the limit. Now, keep in mind that Jeddah doesn't have a straight apart from the one that they start on. You've got the pit straight, and that's it. Everything else is corners. And qualifying, Max Verstappen up against it. In practice, it seemed as though Lewis Hamilton had the upper hand and Mercedes had the upper hand. In qualifying, Max Verstappen suddenly unleashed this almighty lap in the dying stages. Lewis had no response. And then the last corner, he just went a little bit too deep, locked his brake, ran wide, got sideways under enthusiasm on exit and swiped the wall. And that put pay to that. Now, he was lucky in that it cost him that lap, but it didn't cost him a gearbox. Had it cost him that, it would have left him further down the grid. But it set us up for an almighty Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, a race that is going to be famous and infamous in equal measure for the battle that we saw between Lewis and Max, the ferocity of which I've never seen in Formula One. It trumps what we saw with Prost and Senna. It trumps what we saw with Schumacher and Hakkinen. The two not giving an inch. Max Verstappen in particular, not willing to give an inch. Twice going up the inside of Lewis Hamilton at turn one, running wide and copying a penalty for that. And then further around the lap, trying to let Lewis back through. This is midway through the race, about lap 36 or 37 off the top of my head, trying to let Lewis through into the final corner, but doing such that he did so before the DRS line so that he got the DRS use down the next straight. Now, that meant that he had to stamp on the brakes, which is not usually something you do when you've got a car approaching you at racing speed behind you. So he got the penalty for that as well. And that just turned everything up. We were at sort of 9.5, bordering on 10 out of 10 for the drama of that championship battle. That turned it up to Spinal Tap proportions. It immediately went to 11. And we just never really brought it back down from there. We got to Abu Dhabi, and I think Spinal Tap would have had to turn it up to 12. They'd have to go one more again to make it louder. It was just an extraordinary climax to the season that no one would have seen this happen. We've seen these sorts of things before in Suzuka in the years gone past, and in Adelaide in 1994 with Schumacher and Hill, but nothing that comes anywhere close to allegations of a brake test between the title protagonists. 2 penalties totaling 15 seconds for the championship leader, going into the final race of the year tied on points. First time since 1974 that had happened. Absolutely extraordinary. And we haven't even spoken about Abu Dhabi yet.
And yeah, I guess let's get into that final race of the season. The Abu Dhabi Grand Prix was just the ultimate climax to any sporting event in the world. And I think, people talk about, cricket and rugby and different sports and having those incredible moments. But I think this was just unparalleled. These guys going hell for leather at 300 kilometers an hour, putting their lives on the line in what was an incredible race. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like for all measure that race was Lewis's and that the Grand Prix was going to go his way and duly take his 8th championship, but it just flipped on its head in an instance. From your point of view, how did you read that race? Just run us through it from your point of view.
I think your observations is pretty well bang on. You know, you had that exchange on the opening lap. Lewis, whatever the rights and wrongs of it were, maintained the lead, but he was the faster car. Even on fresh tyres, Max Verstappen could not catch Lewis Hamilton. You know, he was doing a really good job at managing his pace, managing the race, managing his tyres, and also managing the gap back to Max rather. He was losing a little bit of time, but that was all being very carefully managed so that he had some firepower left should he need it. And ultimately, he didn't need it. It sort of got taken out of his hands a little bit. But, you know, let's not forget that Formula One is the biggest annual sporting event in the world. It's, you know, only behind the Olympics and the Football World Cup. It is the biggest competition globally. So the eyes that were on this were extraordinary. The pressure that Max and Lewis were under, it had come down in terms of the ferocity from Saudi Arabia right up until about lap 57. And then in a lap and a half, or in 4 minutes, basically, it went from being Lewis's world championship to us proclaiming Max Verstappen world champion for the first time. It was an extraordinary change. But on balance, in a straightforward traditional race, I guess, it was Lewis Hamilton's race. He had the car. He had the pace. He had the track position as well. He had the strategic upper hand. Even with that pit stop, Max didn't have an answer. And then the race got turned on its head.
Just run us through those sort of last sequence of events and maybe if you can dissect and sort of pinpoint maybe where the flaws were in those last few laps, because there has been a lot of discussion in the wake of that event around some of the decisions that were made by the race director, Michael Massey.
Yeah, and this is sort of why I mentioned before the point about how big Formula One is. There is a huge amount of pressure. There is a huge amount of pressure on not just Michael Massey, not on just on the teams, but on the sport itself to have a racing finale. Now, that all ultimately funnels down to Michael Massey, FIA race director. Now, obviously, what triggered all of this was Nicholas Latifi losing control of his Williams with about 5 laps to go. Safety car comes out. That makes perfect sense to lift that car, clear it away, give marshals an opportunity to clean the track, make sure there's no carbon out there that can be picked up by the tyres, do all those sorts of things that they need to do. A lot's been made about the timing of when the cars were released. Now, there are a couple of messages that are unusual to see on the timing screens. One of those is that cars cannot overtake. Now, that's standard practice. The message doesn't normally get relayed, and that's what was a little bit odd, but cars cannot overtake is normal. You can't allow cars to pass the safety car when you've got marshals working on track. You need to control and neutralize the field to protect those individuals working on the track. Once they're off the track, you can release the cars, and that's what Michael Massey did. Whether he did that in conjunction with the rules, I think it's Article 48.12, which states that lap cars need to be released and need to be released a lap before the race resumes, basically in an effort to give them a chance to catch up to the back of the train. That's where it's grey. Mercedes protested initially, then appealed when they lost that protest, and then ultimately withdrew that appeal because the FIA is conducting an analysis. Now, there are lots of rights and wrongs in this. We're probably the wrong people to judge because it's almost a law or a legal discussion at this point, and the wording of the regulations is the critical factor, and the powers of Michael Massey and his interpretation of that. Now, in my opinion, and this is only my opinion, I think Michael probably made the wrong decision. I'm not to say it's deliberate or there are any ulterior motives there, but I think a red flag with 2 laps to go when it was clear that the race wasn't going to restart, with enough laps to have a racing finale in a traditional sense. Red flag. We saw it in Azerbaijan. Have a 2-lap sprint to the flag. Everyone's got an equal chance. Then sure, Lewis would have changed tyres and he probably would have run away with it, but at least it would have been equal. as it is, we've got this bitter aftertaste that, yes, we saw a hell of a championship this year, but the absolute climax of it, and it doesn't matter if you're a Lewis fan or a Max fan or if you're an independent, it just doesn't quite sit as we feel it should. And that's because I don't think we saw a pure sporting finale. We saw one that was a little bit of a roll of the dice. And I'm not to say that Michael rolled the dice and favoured one or the other. It's just circumstances fell and they happened to favour Max Verstappen in that instance.
What could we see out of this investigation by the FIA, do you think?
Since the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, we have seen a change in the political side of the FIA. Jean Todt is now no longer the president. We've got Mohammed Ben Saliem. He's come in charge. He's looking obviously across the board at the FIA structure, but there is an analysis happening. He's very open and very transparent. So I think we're going to get a little bit more information from him, and then hopefully the FIA will be a little bit more forthcoming. Is Michael Massey's job in question? Yeah, you'd have to say absolutely. Purely because if the FIA is reviewing this, you can't go into that and say, well, Michael's job is fine. You know, you're not being objective if you're doing that. You need to go in there with everything on the table. Now, do I think he'll lose his job? Probably not. But you do have to question, is Michael the best person for the job? Now, I personally think he is. He made a mistake in a high-profile, high-pressure situation. Certainly wasn't deliberate. We all make mistakes. It just so happens that his was broadcast to a couple of 100 million people on live television and impacted the Mercedes car company and some very high-profile companies. So maybe we'll see some reform in terms of the safety car regulations. You know, I think the supercar safety rule is pretty good, where they bring the lap cars through the pit lane and just shuffle them to the back. That way, that's actually a reasonably nice way to do it, rather than sending cars off under safety car conditions at racing speed. That seems a more elegant solution. So maybe we'll see some reform on that front. Also just the regulatory side, and some of the rules will be tidied up and tightened, I think. But in terms of radical reform, people losing their jobs, I don't think we'll go that far.
Yep, for sure. There's so much that we could go into just in that battle alone. But I would like to touch on some of the performances of maybe some of the other guys this year. Obviously, Lando Norris had a really good run at the Italian Grand Prix. I think we've seen some really good performances from Esteban Ocon this year. Fernando Alonso's done a really great job, all things considered, in his first year back in Formula One. Who sort of stood out for you outside of the two main protagonists?
For me, the name you listed first there, Lando Norris, he had a standout first half of the year. McLaren season really fell away a little bit after the Italian Grand Prix. But Lando's performance, you know, he was third in the championship for a long period in a car that proved to be the fourth quickest. So, you know, by that maths, logically, he's the sixth or seventh fastest driver, theoretically, yet he was third for a long time. He was unlucky not to win his first Grand Prix in Russia. He scored his first podium. It was a real breakout performance, and one that he needed as well, because for the first time, he was up against a known quantity in Daniel Ricciardo. Now, Carlos Sainz, we know, is very good. He was also another standout for me. He beat Charles Leclerc in the Drivers' Championship in his first season at Ferrari, which is a huge performance. But Lando, he beat Daniel, and he beat Daniel comfortably. Now, there was some adaptation to deal with there for Daniel, but Carlos had that at Ferrari, and Carlos dealt with it better. So for me, Lando's performance was the standout. Then Carlos Sainz. Esteban Ocon was impressive at points, but his car masked his potential a little bit. Same with Fernando Alonso. He delivered as we'd expect. He didn't back down whenever there was a fight. He was always there, as we've come to expect from him. You know, he's an old dog now, and he's showing us he's still got a few tricks. So you know, there's so much to look back on in 2021. And the good thing is, there's so much stability that we're going to see a lot of that in 2022. So, yeah, look for Lando Norris, look for Carlos Sainz, and look for Esteban Ocon. They're sort of the future with Max Verstappen. It's exciting because 2021 was the year at which we sort of see that handover from, I guess, Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton's era to the next generation of kids coming through.
Right, I've got one more question for you, Matt. Obviously, this is sort of an end of an era for Formula One in many ways. These cars obviously going to take a whole new look in 2022 with these new Aero regulations. Do we see much of a change of guard in Formula One, or do you think the engine regulations, by and large, staying the same, will keep sort of the status quo?
The guys at the front are at the front for a reason. They've got the best drivers, they've got the best personnel, they've got the best equipment, they've got the best procedures. That, for me, is why they're at the front. You know, Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, they are going to be the class of the field. Yeah, we might see a little bit of a shuffle down the order, but in terms of those at the very front, I don't see radical changes. Mercedes is going to be quick. Red Bull will be there. Ferrari might take a step forward. I expect at the very back, Haas will move forward because I've had a year to develop their car where everyone else has had, 6 or 8 months. But fundamentally, we're not suddenly going to see Alfa Romeo Sauber winning the championship. We're not going to see Mercedes trundling around in 18th and 19th. It will be more or less, there will be a little bit of movement, but more or less what we've seen for the last couple of years will be what we see in 2022, in my opinion.
Fantastic, Matt. Oh, well, that was some brilliant insight into the 2021 Formula One World Championship. I feel like we could probably chat about this for hours on end. There were so many things that we didn't get to touch on, but yeah, the battle between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton has, I think, captured the imagination of pretty much all motorsport fans. So thank you, Matt, for your time today on KTM Summer Grill. Cheers, mate.
Thank you.
All right, and that concludes our 2021 Formula One recap. Stay tuned to speedcafe.com for another episode of KTM Summer Grill. As part of this year's KTM Summer Grill, each week KTM is giving away the perfect summer beach pack, which includes an umbrella, cap, gym bag, and key holder. To enter the draw, head to speedcafe.com or hit the link in the description below.